All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Michael Higgs, Virtual Programs Manager here at Conscious Capitalism. On behalf of the CCI team, we appreciate you taking time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we're excited to be sharing space with Greg Harmeyer, co-founder of Tier 1 Performance Solutions and CEO of its parent company, Tier 1 Impact, to discuss breaking barriers, creating a framework for conscious leadership in business. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world, working to change the practice and purpose of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our senior leader network membership and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, CCI offers virtual gatherings like this for a community to see how our philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Greg and Tanya, our co-host, will be in conversation for about 25 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to transition to audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of our session. Please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during our time together. If you encounter any technical problems or issues, send us an email to info@consciouscapitalism.org, and we'll do our best to assist you. Now I'm excited to introduce Greg Harmeyer and Tanya Kleindienst to today's conversation. Greg Harmeyer is co-founder of Tier 1 Performance Solutions and CEO of its parent company, Tier 1 Impact. Greg is passionate about unlocking the potential in people, teams, and ideas. During his leadership, Tier 1 has become a multi-year Best Places to Work recipient and 15-time honoree of the Inc. 5000 list of the country's fastest growing privately held companies. Over the course of 20 years, Greg has led Tier 1 to serve hundreds of the world's best organizations in the process developed an award-winning culture that positively impacted thousands of lives. Tanya Kleindienst, Managing Director of Ready to Reach LLC, brings more than 25 years of senior leader organizational development experience with 2 Fortune 500 companies and consulting experience. Tanya's mission is to champion leaders who are ready to create authentic, transformative change that lasts. She leverages human behavior science for the betterment of the human experience. Her services include executive leadership coaching, organizational design and change management, creating corporate culture movements, and leadership team coaching and development. Greg and Tanya, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you both.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thanks so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with both of you. Greg, it was such an honor to be one of the first to read your new book, The Impact with Love, Building Business for a Better World. And I so look forward to the conversation and to learning more from you. I think it's such a great guidebook for all leaders. We're trying to navigate really increasingly unexpected and unpredictable challenges of leadership. And I just found your book to be just a great guidebook for just leading with more confidence and keeping humans at the center of everything that we do, which is such a challenge for leaders. And I find that, some leaders already feel that way, the way you do, keeping humans at the center. Others, this might be new and not maybe so comfortable. So just curious with your thinking around that. Who's the audience for this, and what guidance do you have for leaders that might not be their natural tendency?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya, and thanks to everybody for joining. I'm eager to talk about these topics and share, exchange ideas here. So I think it's a great place to start, Tanya. I tend to believe, if not all people, most people want to make a positive impact on others' lives, and that makes their own life meaningful. And we have this opportunity inside our work as senior leaders, as leaders in the most general sense. In my view, a leader is anybody who influences someone else. So I think most people are a leader in some respect of their lives. And I think we all want to make a positive difference. Sometimes I think we've grown up in a work world where we don't see work as the space that we can do that. We see all the rest of our life as a place to do that, but we don't necessarily see it in work, and we separate the two. And so I think this is what I tried to do is write this for people in leadership roles who want to use their position of influence, particularly in the work world, to make a positive impact on people's lives. And our work environments are so rich with opportunity to do that. Some of it we miss either or take for granted, or we've been taught to think about work differently from the way we might naturally think about people and the rest of our life. And so some of it is trying to bridge that gap and help people who already want to make that impact have frameworks and ways to think about work that will do that.
Yeah, that's great. That reminds me, Greg, in the book, you talk about how leaders, organizations often say people are our greatest asset. And some of the things that you just shared, that's a common phrase. And from your perspective, I found it really interesting. You're saying, well, people aren't assets, but trust is the most important asset. And throughout the book, you talk so much about trust. I'd love if you could expand upon that a little bit, and even as one of the values at Tier 1 of trusting generously. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, it is, from my view for sure, the most central thing in a healthy organization is trust. I believe, and I've shared this with a lot of people, that this idea that, cash, profit are really critical to any business, any organization. They're like oxygen. If you don't have them, you will suffocate. I think there's a famous quote from Peter Drucker along those lines. But I think trust is the next most critical asset. And trust is like the energy or the nutrition that an organization as an organism needs to be healthy. So if you've got lots of trust, you've got, much like if you have a lot of energy, you have engagement, you're active, you're creative, you're committed, you're working towards goals, you feel vibrant and alive. And if you don't, then you're disengaged. You have less motivation. You're more resistant. You're more hesitant to do things. And I think that is the role that trust plays in organizations. It brings people together. It fuels creativity. And so in an agile, modern organization that is moving at the pace that the current world works at, I think it is the most critical thing. And I think there's all kinds of healthy cultures. There's all kinds of different types of cultures. There isn't one formula, but I think trust is central to every one of them. And so we talk a ton about trust in the book because I think if we're going to make a positive impact on people's lives, it has to start with the foundation of trust, and trust has to start with trusting. From a leader perspective and from an organization perspective, trust begets trust. There's actually literal neuroscience that backs that up, but the ability to trust others releases oxytocin in the brain when you feel trusted, and it engages you more and causes you to be more trusting. And so there's this circular nature, and it's a really hard thing, I think, for leaders in complex organizations to trust as fully as they might need to.
Sure. Yes, and along with that trust, there are other important elements of a healthy culture. And we often throw that corporate culture, that term is thrown around quite a bit and means different things to different people. And as you said, there may be a variety of different what's a healthy culture determined by those that are involved in that culture, defining it. But for you, some of those other important elements that you went through great detail in the book were about clarity and consistency, and that a part of that is also building accountability. So if you could expand on those concepts that are related to trust and maybe even foundational to building that trust.
Yeah. Well, kind of back to what you were saying before, that this idea of people are our greatest asset. And I do think organizations say that a lot. and probably mean it in a lot of positive ways, but there's a reality of like, you don't own people, you don't, and assets are typically things that you can control and have on your balance sheet. People will come and go. The trust that remains between them is something that you can continue to develop, and you own your culture in a very real way, and you continually own your culture every day. And so there is this whole getting really clear about who you are and who you aren't. I mean, some organizations are super competitive, or they work a tremendous number of hours. Those are okay if that's who you are. And that's the clarity part of it. I think you run into real risks when you try to say things that you think you're supposed to say about your culture, but they're not real. I think you're much better being authentic. And consistency is how that continues to show up through your actions. One way that I think, we see this right now, it's a really unfortunate thing, is when organizations go through layoffs, whether they have to or they choose to, there's an inconsistency that happens a lot when that happens, because there's a message that organizations often give about we're all in this together, or we're here to support everybody, and then some people are let go. And I think that can be a really damaging dynamic, and we've talked about that before. But I think that's a really important element of an organization, is how you behave, how you show up in everything you do. Now, that's a macro thing, the layoff stuff, but there's lots of micro things. How we treat people in the time of need, how we treat people. I often think our culture is most defined by how we treat the least performers or the people struggling most. Not easy stuff, but it has a huge defining moment for us as a culture. And I do think accountability in every respect is a big part of culture too. As you said, it can be a loaded term. I think organizations it can create a lot of fear in people. It has accountability has a tone of like, we're going to hold people accountable. If they make a mistake, something bad's going to happen. I don't think that's what accountability is. And I think we have to create cultures that support accountability, support people owning their impact on the organization, and help them make mistakes and learn from mistakes. That's an aspect of culture that's super important too. But all those things go together, and I think culture happens through the way we run our businesses. It is an operating thing. It is a management thing. It's not this kind of fuzzy thing that lives out in the ether. It is how we treat each other every day, and how leaders expect people to treat each other. And so if we can bring culture into very practical terms and systems and models and structures in the way we work, we have a lot more influence on how we create a healthy culture.
Sure. It's the day-to-day, that collective, who we are and what we believe, and that all of those things, there's the clarity between all of the things that make up, that you've got this congruency, that it makes sense and it's consistent.
Absolutely. Yes. It is what we live, right? I mean, it's the experience that we have working with each other, and how we work together to get things done, and how leaders in the organizations expect us to work together, and what gets rewarded, what doesn't get rewarded. Those things define culture quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. And it's this is all things that need to be really nurtured and fostered. It doesn't just happen. You've got to be really intentional about it. What advice do you have for leaders that want to do all these things and have know that it's a part of their responsibilities, but they feel the pressures of the day-to-day, quarter-to-quarter earnings, shareholder value creation, and they feel maybe that these are at odds? How do we really put humans at the center and deliver these very short-term financials and profitability? They feel the pressures that these, how do you really advise that it's a both and? They're not at odds. You can do both.
Yeah, I think it's really tough, right? Because stuff's real, and in the current economic climate, it's as real as ever. And leaders at all kinds of levels feel that from all kinds of pressures, right? I started the book with a chapter on mindsets and worldviews. And the reason I did it was because I feel like you got to get really clear about what you believe. And starting with your own belief system about how people fit into your life, what you want to do with them, how you want to influence them, how they fit into the work world, why they matter, who matters, to what degree do they matter, how do you prioritize things like that, and your personal value system. And I just believe like that's the starting point, because everything else can then be built from there. And how you behave and how you interact with people, even in times of pressure, perhaps especially in times of pressure, under duress, under significant challenge, defines who you are, defines your character, and it defines your organization's character. And I think those are really big ideas that we have to grasp. Like how we handle pressure is a defining moment for us. So we got to be really clear about who we want to be as an individual and who we want our organization to be, so that we can behave in the ways that we want to show up. Now, of course, I think in there's also an implied belief system that treating people right and with dignity and with respect and caring about them in authentic ways, about them as human beings, is a worthwhile thing in and of itself. And also it has huge positive implications in a business, even a business under tremendous pressure. You've got stronger relationships, you get more resiliency, you get more engaged people, you get greater commitment to each other, you've got greater trust, and so therefore can work through a lot of things. So I always want to be careful, like not to be like you're doing this so that you get all those other things, because I think doing them in themselves is the right thing to do, and also you do get all those other things, so they go hand in hand. And when we start to think of them in competition with each other, I think it's a flawed mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I imagine that defining those things about who we are, what do we believe, upfront, and being that clarity around it, so that when you're in times of pressure and you've got to lean back on just what comes natural, you're leaning on those definitions that you already have. You've got such clarity and conviction in those that it becomes easier to pull them forward in times of stress or crisis.
I think it's really important, especially because many of us have grown up in, organizational structures that haven't necessarily given us the right models or belief systems, at least in whole. And so we have to articulate them on our own. We have to get really clear about what we believe at a personal level, but certainly as a leader inside an organization, before we can start to make an impact from that. And to getting our own personal clarity is, I think, a really important starting place.
Sure. And speaking of that, about the way maybe we've grown up in the work environment, a lot of our principles and foundation came from such economic and business icons as Milton Friedman and Jack Welch, and really important principles that we've learned, but sometimes missing some of the elements around being human-centered. So who inspires you? What inspiration have you derived from maybe those two or others? And who inspires you today around this conscious leadership?
Yeah, I'm inspired and I learned from a lot of people. So even if I picked on those two, like early in my career, I picked up a lot from those two individuals themselves and some of the things they've written and done. And not all of it was bad. And I know you're not suggesting that at all. Actually, I think they're brilliant people, very successful, but incomplete. A lot of incompleteness to some of the thinking and some of the models, and very particularly a lot of unintended consequences. So it's not like something, and this applies to more generally to a lot of frameworks and thinking that has existed over the years. It's not that it's wrong. It's just that sometimes there's consequences to some of the models. GE was famous for the fire the bottom 10% or the rack and stack ranking. Like there's a lot of consequences to that. Maybe it drove certain performance outcomes that were good, and maybe those performance outcomes benefited certain people too, but there's also a lot of consequences. And so getting clarity about that, and it makes me think like this whole space is an evolution. Learning about how we build more human-centered companies is an evolution. Modern writers, Aaron Dignan's Brave New Work was a great, General Stanley McChrystal's Team of Teams, I found really inspiring, Reinventing Organizations. And those are like in the writer space, but I'll also say, I think just conversations. I'm a big believer that we grow through experience and reflection. So we experience things and then we reflect and think about what did we learn from it and what do we pull into our work. And I think we can learn from other people's experiences and reflect upon those. And so conversations we're fortunate to work with hundreds of organizations. You were a great client of ours at one time, Tanya, and from our conversations, I learned a lot from you. And hearing how different people experience different part of work and what works and what doesn't, you start to shape more thoughts. And that, I think, is a really important part of, I'll say two things about this book that I think are relevant to that. One is, I had a hard time writing it because I had a hard time memorializing beliefs because they are always evolving. So like, I don't necessarily think I or anyone's got it all right. And so I think that's a really important part of it. But I also felt like, sharing some of the experiences we had is what we're trying to do, is kind of contribute to, here's part of the journey.
Sure. It sounds like one of the main attributes of leadership is really the ability to learn and unlearn and hold your values tightly, but your beliefs a little bit more lightly because of that evolution, right? Mhm.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the unlearning concept. I think we always need to be unlearning things that might not have been either appropriate, right, or maybe again are incomplete. And so sometimes we hold on to a belief in a particular thing that might not be bad, but if we're not open to more challenging of it, we can't complete the whole system. And so I think that's a big part of the evolution of this, is the unlearning and learning, and I love how you said that, just kind of holding dear to your values, but the beliefs about kind of how to do things need to continue to evolve and be challenged.
Sure. Yes. It reminds me of I love throughout the book, there's so much advice and guidance, but it's all through experience and relationship. And I love that you call out some of what I'll call the tier one isms, things that you say. One of them in particular that stood out was, we are all in until we're not. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think there can be a tendency sometimes when we're working with someone who's struggling in any organization, to be like, well, we're going to put them on a performance improvement plan, or we're going to work with them for 90 days, and in the back room, people have already written them off and been like, they're never going to make it, or they're not the right person, or they don't get it, or they're not, fill in the blank. And so we use that phrase to talk about those situations of like, we can't hedge our bets with people. We have to be all in on them as a human being, as a person. They may or may not make it in the job. We're in a tough industry. It's not an easy work to do. Not everybody does make it, but we are all in on it with them, alongside them, not standing back looking at like, well, hope it works out for them. Like, we're side by side, and we have some accountability and responsibility to their success. And to the life that they impact with their family and the people around them. And sometimes that means they should work somewhere else. That's okay. Like that can be it's a tough conclusion, but sometimes it's a conclusion and it's the right conclusion. But we have to be all in on it until the very end. And then if it's time to move on, it's time to move on. And that's what we mean by we're all in until we're not. Like, it's not a hedging and a sitting back kind of waiting on it.
I love that. Yeah. I think that's an important, one of the most important takeaways. To that point, I'm wondering if there was just one key insight or takeaway that you wanted the reader, that you really want the reader to take away. What would be one of those most important things that would be a takeaway that you hope?
Yeah, there's probably a couple things if I think about that. And the biggest kind of macro ideas are, one, business is just work. Business, I'll go beyond that, more general. Work is such an awesome opportunity for us to impact each other's lives, build relationships, connect with people, bring meaning to life. We all were born with innate talents and strengths and abilities, and we get to bring them to life to create value for other people through work. And it's just it's a gift. Work is. And as leaders, we should treat it that way. We have the privilege and opportunity to influence others. It's a big responsibility, and it's a big reward when we do it in a positive way. And so that would be like one big thing I'd want people to think about is this is just it's a precious opportunity that is a really meaningful part of our lives. And we have a position of influence to do something about it. And then the other probably big idea I would go to would be the notion that we need to continually be willing to challenge what we believe and to think differently. And so we'll say, there's a lot of brokenness in work and a lot of brokenness in organizations. Doesn't mean work is bad. It doesn't mean organizations are bad. And it certainly doesn't mean that people leading those organizations are bad. But it does mean we should be willing to try something different. And we don't have to have it figured out, but we should be willing to experiment and to step back and say, just because it's always been done this particular way, structures, systems, processes, whatever, like that's what everybody knows. If it's not working, or if it's leading to consequences and outcomes that we don't want, then we should be willing to ask why. And can we try something unorthodox, or can we try something different? And what might that look like? And so that would be the other thing, is encouraging people to say that there are unconventional ways of doing things, and we can challenge things and try different ways. And so we try to provide some of those in the book. But it's not by any means an exhaustive list. It's more like, here's some ways to think about things differently than maybe you have in the past.
Yes, that's wonderful. And the book does such a great job of that, ending each chapter with the summary and those reflection points is just a good reminder for leaders to raise their eye level once in a while and appreciate the gift and the responsibility and reward of leadership. What you're saying, I'm thinking of what's underlying the leadership of what you're talking about. There's a certain degree of vulnerability and confidence in your own position, but understanding that power and influence you have, and a degree of humility and vulnerability that a leader would have to possess to lead in that way that you're describing. So I just wanted to point that out too, that there's some leadership traits there that would help a leader to lead in that way.
I agree with that. And I think those traits make leadership a lot easier, not harder. I think people are fearful of them. They're afraid to perhaps admit weakness or admit unknowing, and we even get into this with communications with leaders. There can be a reluctance to talk about things that there's not definitive answers to, as opposed to just being open and transparent about, this is what we know and what we don't know. This is how we're thinking about it. And in these times, again, when you got it kind of unpredictable economic environments and climates, lots of organizations are going through challenging periods. And I just think the more that you can talk openly about what you're going through, how you think about it, what the options are, what the implications are, the healthier your environment is, the more trust you create. So it does require humility and vulnerability, but it is easier to lead that way once you get comfortable doing it. It has and I do think many of us have grown up in environments where those were like not strong leadership traits, or at least viewed that way. And so it's, I think as leaders, we have a responsibility to try to model those and bring them more into the norm of society's, organizational leaders.
Sure. And so much better for business. And as you said, you're expecting trust. That shows that you trust people and that you are empowering them, which is so inspiring.
Yeah. Well, I think those are really important aspects that every organization can benefit from, regardless of what they're doing. So.
Right. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you, Greg. I can go on for hours and hours, but I'm sure our listeners maybe have some questions or just want to invite Michael back into the conversation.
Yeah, indeed. Just a quick announcement to our attendees. If you do have any questions for Greg or Tanya, please do feel free to put those in the chat, or excuse me, not the chat, the Q&A box, so that we can work through those in conversation with Greg. Wow, Greg. I think Tanya touched on this, but the invitation to show up with vulnerability. And the other thing that I was really moved by was the notion of the unlearning organization, an organization that is willing to unlearn perhaps some bad habits or rethink some of their abandoned frameworks, all in the spirit of growing, evolving, and becoming more human-centric. So thank you for Tanya, the very thoughtful questions and the awesome reflections, Greg. I do want to jump to a question that we have here from an anonymous attendee, excuse me. And the question is, what if people don't participate when you're trying to teach leaders new behaviors to build a better culture? What are maybe some of the best practices to engage them rather than just merely being punitive as you approach the growth of those leaders.
Yeah, and Tanya, I would love your expertise on this, because I know you do a lot of coaching in this space. Maybe if you want to start with thoughts, I can certainly share mine.
Yeah, sure. I think really starting there's a couple of steps before teaching leaders new behaviors for that culture that I would begin, just really getting aligned in what is our strategy as an organization, what are we all about, what do we believe, and making sure there's alignment around those values and strategy and what brings us together as a group. Start with that and then lead into, and then these are the behaviors that support that. What are those traits and behaviors that support what we're trying to accomplish collectively, not only for ourselves as individuals, for the team, the organization, the communities, and the world, and ladder up to that. But if you got alignment around that, then that conversation about what behaviors are supported within the culture that we want to nurture is an easier conversation. And if people just aren't aligned with those things, they'll hopefully self-select out. Every culture isn't right for every individual. And if they're back to what Greg was saying about clarity and consistency, if you're providing those things, people will know, is this a place where I can thrive and be successful? And it opens that conversation that it's not personal. It's about connection and can we be successful together? But Greg, please.
No, I agree with all that. I would add, I think where you spend your energy and who you spend it on, it's attention is, and I'm not saying ignore those people. I'm saying focus on the people who do get it. Focus on the people who are leaning in, and the consistency of messaging and everything you do as a leader builds, it accumulates over time. So like, it's a journey for everybody. And we've certainly had people who were skeptical of our environment when they started, even senior people. And you can't expect everybody to be at the same spot over, at once. But you can orient the organization's energy or the team's energy or whatever you're leading to the people who are engaged in building what you're trying to build. And the others will, as you said, Tanya, will come along because they'll see it. They'll see the benefits of it. They'll see the collaboration that happens, the connection, the energy that's created, or they'll self-select and decide they don't want to be a part of that, which is okay too. But I think it's a consistent focus of time and energy towards the behaviors and the mindsets that you want.
And the one thing I would add before we move on from that is people are also looking for the consistency in and outside of the organization. The way that you show up to customers and the community, is there coherence of these traits and behaviors internally as well? That consistency and clarity goes in and out of the organization. That helps to really define what those traits and behaviors you're looking for and help people to be really clear about what's expected.
Thank you both for those reflections. We have a question here from Diane Sutter. Welcome, Diane. She's one of our Senior Leader Network members. She asked, where do you see purpose, both personal purpose and the organization's purpose, fitting in? And how do we get consensus on what that is?
Yeah, I think purpose, probably at both levels, is a process of discovery. Like, I don't know that everybody knows their personal purpose at an early age. I didn't, at least, and I think a lot of people don't. And to some degrees, I think that's true with an organization too. You start, like when you're young as a company, your purpose is to keep existing, like it's, and maybe not literally, maybe you want it to be something more than that, but it's hard to think sometimes beyond that, when you're trying to get a business going, and that takes shape over time. We talk about our purpose is to help people do their best work. And it's the nature of some of the opportunity in the industry we're in. And it shapes a lot of our conversation about what does that mean? How do we help people do their best work internally? What does that look like? Externally, what does the work look like? But it does bind people together. And we're fortunate because there's certain industries like healthcare or whatever that have natural, meaningful purposes. Sometimes it feels a little bit, harder to draw inspiration out of it, but it can be found. It absolutely can be found. And it's worth doing because it brings people back to our team exists for meaning. So I think that's really important. Individuals have to figure out if that meaning aligns with something they care about or not. I also always encourage people within the work that we're doing to accomplish that purpose, we also make an impact in people's lives. So their individual purposes might be fulfilled just through the existence of their work, of interacting with other people, and it might not be as driven by the end purpose of the organization. That can be okay. So it just creates space and a platform for them to do that work.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Any thoughts, Tanya, on that, the joining of personal and organizational purpose as you've seen working clients? Or
yes, no, I fully agree. It's a discovery process for sure. And finding that the meaning within can be so powerful for people, that we want to contribute to something bigger. We want to make sure that the way we contribute and what we're doing in our work is meaningful and having some sort of positive impact. And there's nothing more powerful than collectively bringing people together around a common purpose.
Indeed. Our next question is from Neville or Neville. Apologies on the pronunciation. This is more oriented towards our future leaders, you know, that the group that's sort of coming up now. And, you know, there's an acknowledgement that people are the greatest asset, but organizations place them on the cost side of the gap balance sheet, not necessarily as an investment. Do you have any perspectives to share on those future leaders that are coming up? How might they consider, and to borrow the language here, flip the script for the future leaders and the stakeholders?
Yeah, it's a good observation. You know, we do look at people as a cost, as an expense, and from a pure accounting standpoint, they are, right? Like that's just a reality. And it's an important metaphor to be conscious of, because it's a very limited thinking, and to kind of take it further, when organizations try to improve financially, one of the biggest things they cut is people. So this gets back to the kind of mindsets and worldviews, and I think understanding how everything good in an organization is born out of people, and articulating that. I tell people in our organization, there's, you know, I don't know, probably 15 or 20 different types of capabilities and things that we do really well that have grown over the years. And I'll share stories about how they were born out of individuals who had a passion for something and an idea. And it wasn't a grand strategy. It wasn't like we sat in a room and said, we're going to go build this research capability in the federal government. Somebody came to me with a passion about it and said, I think we have the skills and makeup to do this kind of work. Can I go after this? And I'm using that as an example because the more you can tell the stories of how people have shaped the organization and how ideas and creativity and ingenuity and teams and collaboration have impacted the organization, I think you can flip that script of how people think about people. And you start to recognize, like, we don't have a future if we don't have great people, if we don't have great teams of people. Everything that we're doing, and again, in today's world, I think it's more true than ever because things change so fast. So you better be in a position to have great energy and creativity and innovation to be able to adapt to it, or whatever you're doing today is just going to be quickly obsolete, and you're not going to have the resources you need to get there. So I think telling the stories is a good way to shape thinking.
Wonderful. I want to take a question here from Mark Mears, who is another one of our senior leader network members. And he says, with Gallup reporting record low levels of engagement, what the younger generation might refer to as quiet quitting, how do we get C-level executives to change leadership behaviors that created the dynamic? And maybe more specifically, Greg, you opened speaking a lot about trust within an organization. How do we manage that trust across an organization when perhaps some of our workforce is either hybrid or remote?
That's a tough and timely one, isn't it?
Indeed.
I will share some of my thoughts. Like, we're a hybrid for sure. And I haven't found a way to discount personal connectivity and personal relationships. Like, I don't fully, like, not interacting in person is just, it's difficult to build true authentic relationships without personal interaction and personal time together. And technology is a poor medium for building relationships. It's building true authentic relationships. And so I think helping people understand some of that, and I think that's what a lot of C-level executives are struggling with in the pure work environment mode. You know, there's a circular thing here. When you give people, when people don't recognize that their work matters and that they matter to a team and the purpose that they're accomplishing, you're giving them a reason to disengage and quit. And I do think there's, like, when people are fully working alone, particularly if you're early in your career, and I'm not saying this is a generalization for everybody, but I do think it devolves into people in a negative space. It can be unhealthy to be that isolated. And so being clear about some beliefs around those things is important. Some people will choose that, that's okay, but I do think that has an implication. So there's a circular piece there, but you've got to give them a meaningful engagement and experience to feel a part of something that they're connected to, so that they don't want to quit.
Yeah, indeed. Let's see, we've got about 3 minutes left, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I do want to take a few moments to just make a couple closing remarks. I'm going to put a link to a survey in the chat. If you could take a moment or two, it's 3 questions, very easy to fill out. It does inform our future programming and is helpful to the organization. And also, I just want to extend a huge thank you both to you, Tanya, and Greg, for today's conversation. Incredibly insightful and inspiring. A couple of those nuggets, Greg, the unlearning within an organization, and also, you know, staying with people who need to grow until the very end, until it's not the right decision, and having the courage to do so. For the benefit of both parties. Really, really powerful stuff. For anyone who is joining us for the first time, you can learn more about our organization, Conscious Capitalism, on our website, consciouscapitalism.org. If you are a senior leader practicing conscious capitalism within your organization, please reach out. We would love to make those connections with you and introduce you to our network. We also have some more virtual gatherings coming up in the month of May. Next week, we have one with Vital Farms, the egg producer, to talk about impact reporting. And thank you again, Tanya and Greg, and all of our audience members for joining us today and contributing to the thoughtful conversation with our guests. Wishing everyone a fantastic afternoon. Greg and Tanya as well, if there's any ways that guests can reach out to you via websites or LinkedIn, feel free to mention those quickly before we end the call. We'll start with you, Greg.
Well, for sure. Our website is tier1performance.com. It's TIER, the number 1 performance.com. And certainly, you know, you can find me on LinkedIn. I would be happy to connect with anybody. Yes, please reach out if you've got thoughts, reactions, questions, ideas, perspectives. Like I said, for me, it's a big part of the learning journey, is to hear from all kinds of other people. So just appreciate you hosting us, Michael, and Conscious Capitalism for hosting us. And Tanya, certainly appreciate the dialogue as always. And thanks for your partnership on this.
Thank you. Yes, the same, much appreciation. Just honored to have this conversation with you, Greg. And thank you, Michael. And I can also be found on LinkedIn. Would love to continue the conversation.
Dynamite. Well, again, wishing everyone a fantastic rest of your day. And thank you both again. And we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.